My own mother betrayed me and helped cheating wife in divorce. My revenge was ruthless. Don't you dare use our children to manipulate me, Leighton said, his grip tightening on the phone. You're the one who changed the schedule without telling me. The only thing I'm obsessed with is protecting our children from your lies, Leighton countered. And if you're tracking my movements, that's just more evidence of your manipulation. Hey. How are you today? Thanks for being here with me, listening to cheating stories on Reddit. It's really interesting, but also reveals a lot of pain, broken families. It shows the complexity in relationships, emotions. Stay until the end of the video. The real exciting details will be shared. We are Reddit cheating stories. Leighton pushed the door open, the quiet creak of the hinges cutting through the stillness of the house. The faint sounds from upstairs grew clearer. A soft laugh, followed by the unmistakable murmur of conversation. He set his bag down by the door with deliberate calm, his heart pounding in his chest. His shoes barely made a sound on the hardwood floor as he stepped inside, the air heavy with a tension he couldn't explain but couldn't ignore. The faint scent of cologne hung in the air, unfamiliar and out of place. He walked to the base of the stairs, pausing as another laugh, Kaya's laugh, floated down from the second floor. It was a laugh he hadn't heard in months, light and carefree, so different from the strained conversations they'd been having lately. But it wasn't for him. With each step he took up the stairs, the sounds grew louder. He stopped in front of the bedroom door, which was slightly ajar. Through the gap, he saw a shadow move, a figure too large to be Kaya's. His grip tightened on the doorknob, his breath catching in his throat. For a brief moment, he thought about turning around, walking away, pretending he hadn't come home early, hadn't seen the car, hadn't heard the voices. But he couldn't. Leighton pushed the door open with a firm hand, the sight before him freezing him in place. Kaya was sitting on the edge of the bed, her hair tousled and her face flushed, while Bryson stood a few feet away, his jacket draped over a chair and his tie hanging loosely around his neck. The air in the room felt stifling, heavy with unspoken words. Kaya's eyes widened as she saw him, her face draining of color. "Leighton," she stammered, rising to her feet. "You're home early." Bryson's expression shifted from surprise to discomfort, his gaze darting between Leighton and Kaya. "I think I should," he began, but Leighton cut him off with a sharp look. "Don't," Leighton said, his voice low and steady. "Just don't." The silence stretched, the weight of the moment pressing down on all of them. Kaya stepped toward Leighton, her hands raised in a placating gesture. "Leighton, this isn't what it looks like," she said, her voice trembling. "We were just working." Leighton finished for her, his tone bitter. "Because it looks like you've been doing plenty of that lately." Kaya flinched at the coldness in his voice, tears welling in her eyes. "It's not what you think," she insisted. Nothing happened. Leighton turned his gaze to Bryson, who shifted uncomfortably under the scrutiny. "Get out," Leighton said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Bryson hesitated, glancing at Kaya, who nodded almost imperceptibly. He grabbed his jacket, avoiding Leighton's glare, and slipped out of the room without another word. The sound of the front door closing echoed through the house. Kaya reached for Leighton, but he stepped back, the distance between them feeling insurmountable. "How long?" he asked, his voice quiet but firm. "How long has this been going on?" "It's not what you think," Kaya repeated, her voice breaking. "It wasn't supposed to be like this. I never meant—" Leighton held up a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. "Don't," he said. "Don't insult me by pretending this was an accident. You've been pulling away for months, Kaya. I thought it was work, stress, anything but this." Tears streamed down her face as she shook her head. "Leighton, I love you. I made a mistake, but it doesn't have to end like this. We can fix this. Love doesn't look like this," he replied, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. "Love doesn't betray. Love doesn't lie." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Kaya's sobs filled the silence, but Leighton couldn't bring himself to comfort her. The weight of her betrayal pressed down on him, suffocating and inescapable. Finally, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving Kaya standing alone. As he descended the stairs and stepped outside into the fading sunlight, Leighton felt the first stirrings of clarity. The life he'd known was gone, shattered by her choices, but he was still standing. And for now, that was enough. Leighton stared at her in disbelief, the audacity of her words momentarily stealing his voice. His chest heaved with the effort to keep his composure, but his hands were clenched into fists at his sides, his knuckles white. "I had no right," he echoed, his voice low and dangerous. "No right to confront the man who just defiled my home? My marriage? Are you even listening to yourself? Kaya?" Her eyes flashed with anger as she tightened the sheet around herself. "You don't understand." "You're right," Leighton interrupted, his voice rising. "I don't understand. I don't understand how the woman I loved, the mother of my children, could do this. In our home, Kaya. In our bed." Kaya's defiance faltered for a moment, a flicker of guilt crossing her face, but it was gone as quickly as it came. "You were never here, Leighton," she snapped. "Always at work, always distracted. I felt invisible." Leighton laughed bitterly, the sound cutting through the tense air like a blade. "So, this is my fault now? Because I worked hard to provide for you, for our family? Because I trusted you to honor the vows we made?" Kaya opened her mouth to respond but seemed to think better of it. She crossed her arms, her expression hardening again. "This conversation is going nowhere," she said coolly. "We need to talk about this when you're calmer." "When I'm calmer?" Leighton took a step closer, his voice trembling with restrained fury. "You don't get to dictate how I feel right now, Kaya. You don't get to spin this into something I need to fix. You made a choice, a selfish, destructive choice, and now you're trying to make it my problem." Kaya turned her back to him, staring out the window as if the scene outside could offer her an escape from the confrontation. "I think you should leave," she said quietly. "For the kids. They don't need to hear this." Leighton froze, the weight of her words settling over him like a heavy fog. "For the kids," he repeated bitterly. "The same kids you didn't think about when you brought another man into our home?" She flinched but didn't turn around. Leighton shook his head, his voice dropping to a cold, emotionless tone. "I'll leave, Kaya, but not because you told me to. I'll leave because I can't stand to be here right now. Pack your things. You'll explain this to the kids when the time comes. And trust me, there will be no sugarcoating the truth." He turned and walked out of the bedroom, his footsteps steady and deliberate. The air in the hallway felt suffocating, every family photo a cruel reminder of the life he thought they had. His chest ached, but he refused to let the tears come. As he reached the front door, he hesitated, glancing back one last time at the house that had been his sanctuary. Now it felt like a stranger's house, tainted and unfamiliar. With a deep breath, he stepped outside, the sound of the door closing behind him marking the end of one chapter and the painful beginning of another. The sun had dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the lawn. The Mercedes was gone, but its absence did little to erase the events that had transpired. Leighton climbed into his car, his hands gripping the wheel tightly as he drove away, unsure of where he was going, but certain of one thing. There was no going back. Leighton gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white as he drove, the suburban streets blurring past. Kaya's words replayed in his mind, each one a knife twisting deeper into his chest. He could still hear her cold, calculated tone, the way she'd wielded their children as weapons, and the smug smirk that had accompanied her devastating ultimatum. He didn't realize where he was going until he pulled into his mother's driveway. The modest house stood exactly as he remembered it, its flower-filled window boxes a stark contrast to the chaos raging inside him. He sat in the car for a moment, his head resting against the steering wheel, trying to gather himself. When he finally stepped out and approached the door, it opened before he could knock. Marlene Adams stood there, her gray hair neatly pinned back, her warm brown eyes widening in concern as she took in his disheveled appearance. "Leighton," she said softly, pulling him into a hug. "What's wrong?" The dam broke. For the first time since walking in on Kaya and Bryson, he let himself feel the full weight of the betrayal, the anger, the heartbreak. His mother led him inside, guiding him to the couch where he sank down heavily, his head in his hands. "It's Kaya," he managed, his voice hoarse. She's been having an affair." Marlene's face tightened, but she didn't interrupt. She sat beside him, one hand resting lightly on his shoulder, the other holding a mug of tea she'd prepared without a word. "She threatened me," he continued, his words tumbling out. "She said if I left, she'd make sure I lost the kids. She's been building a case against me, twisting things, lying. I don't know what to do, Mom. She's not the woman I married. I don't even know who she is anymore." Marlene's hand tightened slightly, her voice calm but firm. "Leighton, listen to me. You're stronger than you think. This isn't just about her betrayal. This is about you standing up for yourself and for your children. You don't have to let her control the narrative." Leighton looked at her, desperation etched into his features. "But what if she takes the kids? What if she really can turn everything against me?" Marlene shook her head, her voice unwavering. "She's playing a game, Leighton, but games like hers rely on fear and manipulation. You need to get ahead of her. Talk to a lawyer. Document everything. If she's been planning this, you need to be prepared too. And remember, the truth matters. You've been a good father, a good husband. Don't let her make you believe otherwise." Her words were like a lifeline in the storm, grounding him in a way he hadn't thought possible. For the first time since the nightmare had begun, he felt a glimmer of hope. "You're right," he said, his voice steadier now. "I need to fight back, not just for me, but for the kids. They deserve better than this." Marlene nodded, her eyes fierce with determination. "That's my boy. And no matter what happens, Leighton, you're not alone. You've got me, and you've got people who care about you. We'll get through this together." As he left his mother's house that evening, the air felt a little lighter. The cherry blossoms still danced in the breeze, but now they seemed less like mockery and more like a reminder. Even after the harshest storms, new beginnings were possible, and Leighton was ready to fight for his. She drove through the familiar streets of his childhood, the neighborhood blurring past as Leighton made his way to his mother's house. Every turn brought memories of simpler times. The corner where he'd crashed his bike while learning to ride without training wheels, the park where his mother had taught him to fly a kite, and the old oak tree where she had comforted him after his first heartbreak. Marlene Adams had always been his anchor, the one person he could rely on when the world stopped making sense. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across her well-maintained front yard as he pulled into the driveway. Her flower beds bloomed with early spring color, purple crocuses and yellow daffodils she planted every year without fail. The sight of such normalcy made his chest ache. Before he could reach the front door, it swung open. Marlene stood there, her face already etched with concern, the expression that had preceded countless conversations over hot chocolate and freshly baked cookies throughout his life. "Leighton?" Her eyes widened as she took in his disheveled appearance. "What's wrong? You look terrible, sweetheart." The familiar endearment nearly undid him. He followed her into the kitchen, where the smell of snickerdoodles filled the air. She'd been stress baking again, a habit she'd had since his childhood, turning any family crisis into an excuse to refill the cookie jar. "Sit," she commanded, pulling out a chair at the kitchen table. The same table where she had helped him with homework, explained why his father wasn't coming home anymore, and supported him through every major decision in his life. "Tell me what's happened." Leighton sank into the chair, the events of the past few hours washing over him again. "It's Kaya," he managed, his voice rough. "I came home early today and found her in bed with Bryson." "Bryson?" Marlene's eyebrows shot up as she sat across from him, pushing a plate of cookies his way. "Her boss? The one she's always talking about?" Leighton nodded, the words spilling out in a bitter rush. He recounted every detail. The scattered clothes on the stairs, the scene in the bedroom, Kaya's cold disregard for their marriage vows. "She even threatened to take the kids," he finished, his hands trembling as he gripped the unused napkin in front of him. "She said she's been building a case against me, claiming I'm abusive, that I have anger issues. She's going to lie to take my children away from me, Mom." As he spoke, Marlene's expression shifted, distant, almost unreadable. She fidgeted with her apron, the one he had given her last Mother's Day, and avoided his gaze. The silence stretched, broken only by the steady tick of the antique clock on the wall. "Well," she said finally, her voice careful, measured, "these things happen in marriages." Leighton stared at her, sure he had misheard. The cookies on the plate between them seemed to mock him with their homey comfort. These things happen? Mom, she was having sex with her boss in our bed. People make mistakes, dear, Marlene replied, her tone placating in a way that made his teeth grind. It was the same tone she had used when explaining away his father's absences years ago. Maybe if you try to understand why she felt the need to look elsewhere. Are you seriously defending her? Leighton pushed back from the table, the chair scraping against the linoleum. She cheated on me. She threatened to take my children away. And maybe that's exactly what will happen if you don't handle this with maturity. Marlene snapped, her gentle demeanor cracking. She stood, her small frame somehow filling the kitchen with disapproval. Do you have any idea how messy divorces can get? How much damage they do to children? So I'm just supposed to accept my wife having an affair? Leighton's voice rose to match hers. Let her destroy our family while I stand by and watch. You're supposed to think about what's best for everyone. Marlene slapped her palm against the table, making the cookies jump. Your father and I had our problems, but I stayed. Don't you dare compare this to Dad, Leighton interrupted. He left you for another woman. He abandoned us. And now you're telling me to just accept the same thing happening to my children. I'm telling you to be practical, Marlene said, her face flushing with anger. She drove through the familiar streets of his childhood as the neighborhood blurred past, Leighton on his way to his mother's house. Each turn brought back memories of simpler times. The corner where he had crashed his bike while learning to ride without training wheels, the park where his mother had taught him to fly a kite, the old oak tree where she had comforted him after his first heartbreak. Marlene Adams had always been his anchor, the one person he could rely on when the world stopped making sense. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across her immaculately kept front yard as he pulled into the driveway. Her flower beds were in full bloom, filled with purple crocuses and yellow daffodils she planted every spring without fail. The sight of such unchanging normalcy made his chest tighten. Before he could reach the door, it swung open. Marlene stood there, her expression already etched with concern. The same look that had accompanied countless conversations over hot chocolate and freshly baked cookies throughout his life. Leighton? Her eyes widened as she took in his disheveled appearance. What's wrong? You look awful, sweetheart. The familiar endearment nearly undid him. He followed her into the kitchen, where the warm, sweet aroma of snickerdoodles filled the air. She'd been stress baking again, just as she had during every family crisis since he was a child. Sit, she instructed, pulling out a chair at the kitchen table. The same table where she had helped him with homework, explained his father's absence, and supported him through every major life decision. Tell me what's happened. Leighton sank into the chair as the events of the day crashed over him once more. It's Kaya, he began, his voice rough. I came home early today and found her in bed with Bryson. Bryson? Marlene's eyebrows arched as she sat across from him, sliding a plate of cookies in his direction. Her boss? The one she's always mentioning. He nodded, the bitter words spilling out of him. He told her everything. The scattered clothes on the stairs, the scene in the bedroom, Kaya's cold disregard for their marriage vows. She even threatened to take the kids. He finished, his hands trembling as he gripped the napkin in front of him. She said she's been building a case against me, claims I'm abusive, that I have anger issues. She's gonna lie to take my children away from me, Mom. Marlene's expression grew distant, her gaze dropping to her hands as she fidgeted with her apron, the one he had gifted her last Mother's Day. The silence stretched, broken only by the steady ticking of the antique clock on the wall. These things happen in marriages, she said finally, her tone careful and measured. Leighton stared at her, certain he had misheard. The cookies on the plate seemed to mock him with their deceptive simplicity. These things happen? He repeated, incredulous. Mom, she was having sex with her boss in our bed. People make mistakes, dear, Marlene replied, her tone placating. It was the same voice she had used when explaining his father's absences so many years ago. Maybe if you try to understand why she felt the need to look elsewhere. Are you seriously defending her? Leighton pushed his chair back abruptly, the legs scraping loudly against the linoleum. She cheated on me. She threatened to take my children away. And maybe that's exactly what will happen if you don't handle this with maturity. Marlene snapped, her gentle demeanor fracturing. She stood, her small frame somehow filling the room with disapproval. Do you have any idea how messy divorces can get? How much they hurt children? So, I'm just supposed to accept my wife having an affair? Leighton's voice rose, sharp with disbelief. Let her destroy our family while I stand by and watch. You're supposed to think about what's best for everyone, she shot back, slamming her palm on the table. Your father and I had our problems, but I stayed. Don't you dare compare this to Dad, Leighton interrupted, his voice raw with anger. He left you for another woman. He abandoned us. And now you're telling me to just accept the same thing happening to my children? I'm telling you to be practical, Marlene said, her cheeks flushing with frustration. You think you can fight this? You think you can win against a woman who's already prepared for battle? Wake up, Leighton. The courts always favor the mother. You'll lose everything. The house, the children, your reputation. And for what? Pride. For what's right, Leighton shouted back. For the truth. For my children's right to have a father who stands up against lies and manipulation. Then perhaps it's best if you don't come around here anymore, she said quietly. Her words fell between them like stones, heavy and cold. What? Leighton whispered, the floor tilting beneath him. You heard me? Marlene's jaw set in a familiar, unyielding line. Either you find a way to work things out with Kaya, or you'll lose me as a mother. It's that simple. The second betrayal of the day slammed into him, taking his breath away. First Kaya, now his mother. The two women he had trusted most in the world, both turning against him within hours. One small mistake, he repeated, his voice hollow. That's what you call this? Destroying a family? Threatening to take my children away? Using lies and manipulation to cover up an affair? I call it life, Marlene replied firmly. And sometimes life requires us to be bigger than our hurt feelings. Sometimes we have to swallow our pride for the greater good. Your father. Just stop, Leighton interrupted, raising a hand. This isn't about Dad. This isn't about your marriage or your choices. This is about my wife betraying everything we built together. And my mother choosing to support her over her own son. I'm supporting what's best for my grandchildren, Marlene said, her voice breaking. I'm thinking about them, Leighton roared. I'm thinking about what it teaches them if I let their mother manipulate and lie. About the example I set if I let her destroy everything we built without a fight. Then you're a fool, Marlene said coldly. And you'll lose everything, just like your father did. Leighton stared at her, truly looking at her for the first time. And in that moment, he realized he no longer recognized the woman standing before him. I need to go, he said quietly, turning toward the door. Leighton, Marlene called after him, her voice tinged with panic. Don't do this. Don't throw everything away over pride. This isn't about pride, he said without turning back. This is about truth, about justice, about being someone my children can respect, even if it costs me everything else. He walked out, leaving her in the kitchen with her cooling cookies and compromised morals. The screen door slammed shut behind him, a sound of finality that echoed in his chest. Driving in a fog of betrayal, he found himself at Morton Park, where he used to bring the kids. The playground stood empty in the fading light, the swings swaying gently in the breeze like ghosts of happier times. Sitting in his car, Leighton tried to process the implosion of his life. The betrayal, the ultimatums, the alliances against him. His phone chirped, cutting through the silence. A text from Kaya. The children are asking where you are. What should I tell them? Her casual manipulation made his jaw tighten. She knew exactly what she was doing, using their children as pawns. With trembling fingers, he opened his contacts and found the number for James Morton, the best divorce attorney in the city. It was after hours, but he left a detailed message. Then he opened his notes app and began documenting everything. Every word, every threat, every betrayal. If Kaya wanted a fight, he would make sure he was ready. He would not let her take his children. He would not let her destroy everything he held dear. He typed, "Did I?" His initial shock and hurt began to crystallize into something harder, something colder. Kaya and his mother had made their choices, chosen their sides in the war they had forced upon him. Now, he would make his own choice. He would fight, not just for his dignity, but for his children, for justice, for everything that mattered. The night stretched out before him, full of uncertainty and pain. But as he sat in the darkness, one thing became unmistakably clear. There would be no forgiveness, no reconciliation, no going back. Kaya had drawn a line in the sand with her betrayal, and he would make sure she lived to regret crossing it. 3 days after discovering his wife's betrayal, Leighton sat in his makeshift office, a corner booth at Riverside Diner. The waitresses kept his coffee cup full and asked no questions. His laptop screen displayed a social media profile he had studied dozens of times. Callie Harrison, Bryson's wife of 15 years. The bell above the diner door chimed. Leighton looked up to see a tall woman with auburn hair step inside, her eyes scanning the room with a mix of nervous energy and determination. She wore a tailored navy blazer and carried herself with the poise of someone accustomed to corporate events and formal dinners. "Mrs. Harrison?" Leighton stood and gestured toward the booth. "Thank you for coming." Callie's sharp green eyes studied him as she slid into the seat across from him. "Please call me Callie," she said. "Though I have to admit, I'm not sure why I'm here, Mr. Adams." "Leighton," he corrected her. Ruby, the elderly waitress, approached with a fresh pot of coffee. "Can I get you anything, honey?" Ruby asked Callie, pen poised over her notepad. "Just coffee, black." Callie waited until Ruby shuffled away before leaning in. "Your message said this was about Bryson. Is there a problem at the office?" Leighton took a slow breath, studying the woman across from him. She had the same tense posture he'd noticed in himself lately, a person bearing a weight they couldn't yet name. "When was the last time Bryson worked late?" he asked quietly. A flicker of something, recognition, pain, uncertainty, crossed Callie's face. "I don't see how that's any of your business." 3 nights ago, Leighton continued, keeping his tone steady. "I came home early from work and found my wife, Kaya, in bed with your husband." The color drained from Callie's face. Her hands, wrapped around the coffee cup Ruby had just delivered, began to tremble. I'm not sure what you expect me to say to that." "I expect you to tell me the truth," Leighton said, meeting her gaze directly. "Have you suspected something was going on?" Callie's laugh was bitter cutting. "Suspected?" "Leighton, I've known something was wrong for months. The late meetings, the weekend conferences, the constant texts." She shook her head, her voice heavy with frustration. "But knowing and proving are 2 very different things." "I have proof." Leighton pulled out his phone and scrolled through photos of the text messages he'd found on Kaya's iPad. Messages she hadn't bothered to delete in her arrogance. Times, dates, locations. Everything. Callie's hands shook as she took the phone. Her eyes scanned the messages, and with each swipe of her finger, her expression hardened. "That bastard," she whispered. "All those times he told me I was being paranoid, that I was imagining things. They've been gaslighting both of us," Leighton said, taking the phone back. "And now Kaya's threatening to take my children away if I don't accept their affair and go along with it." "What?" Callie's head snapped up, her eyes blazing. "She's trying to blackmail you with your own children? She claims she's been building a case against me," Leighton explained, his jaw tightening at the memory. "Says she'll tell the courts I'm abusive, that I have anger issues. She's prepared to lie and destroy me if I don't let her continue seeing Bryson." "That sounds familiar." Callie's mouth twisted into a grimace. "Bryson's been laying similar groundwork, telling our friends I've become unstable, that I'm imagining things. I even caught him recording our arguments on his phone, building his own case." Leighton nodded. "They're working together on this, trying to protect themselves by destroying us." Callie sat back, her coffee untouched. "Why are you telling me this? What do you want from me?" "An alliance," Leighton said, leaning forward, his voice steady and intense. "They think they can manipulate and threaten us into submission because we're alone. But together? Together we can fight back. I have evidence of their affair, and I'm betting you have evidence of Bryson's manipulation. If we pool our resources, we could expose them," Callie said, a spark of interest lighting her eyes. "But exposure isn't enough. They'll just paint us as bitter, jealous spouses trying to ruin their reputations. Which is why we need more," Leighton replied, pulling out a manila folder and laying it on the table. "I've been doing some digging. Those business trips they took, the expenses don't add up. They've been using company resources to fund their affair. Callie's eyes widened as she flipped through the documents. This is financial misconduct. Fraud. And I'm betting it goes deeper, Leighton said, watching her process the information. Bryson's your husband. You know his passwords, his habits, his hiding places. I need access to prove what they've done, to protect my children from Kaya's threats. Will you help me? Callie was quiet for a long moment, staring at the evidence before her. When she looked up, her eyes were hard with determination. Bryson has a private email account he doesn't think I know about. He uses the same password for everything. Our anniversary date, the arrogant bastard. Give me your laptop. For the next 2 hours, they pieced together a trail of deception that went far beyond their broken marriages. Expense reports that didn't match travel records. Hotel charges for rooms booked under false names. Company credit cards used for personal expenses, later classified as business development. Look at this, Callie said, pointing to a series of transactions. These restaurant charges? They're all from places near their supposed conference locations. But the timestamps don't match the conference schedules. They were sneaking off during work events, making the company pay for their dates. Leighton's disgust was evident. And here, these team-building expenses? All charged to projects under Kaya's supervision, approved by Bryson. They've been embezzling company funds to finance their affair. This is bigger than we thought, Callie said, sitting back and running a hand through her hair. This isn't just about the affair anymore. This is corporate fraud, which means we have leverage, Leighton said grimly. Kaya wants to threaten me with losing my children? Let's see how she handles the threat of losing her freedom. We need to be careful, Callie warned. They'll fight back hard when they realize what we're doing, and they've already laid the groundwork to discredit us. Then we'll be smarter than them. Leighton began gathering the documents. We need more evidence. Something irrefutable. Bank statements, hotel receipts, security camera footage. Anything that proves they've been misusing company resources. I can help with that, Callie said, a sharp smile forming. Bryson's not as clever as he thinks he is. He keeps all his passwords in a notebook in his desk drawer at home. And I know exactly where he hides his private files. You're willing to risk everything to expose them? Leighton asked, studying her face. Once we start this, there's no going back. They've already taken everything from us, Callie said, her voice like steel. Our trust, our marriages, our dignity. Now it's our turn to take something from them. Their carefully constructed lies. As they finalized their plans, Leighton felt something he hadn't experienced since discovering Kaya's betrayal. Hope. Not the desperate hope of reconciliation or forgiveness. Those bridges were burned. This was the hope of justice, of vindication, of proving that truth could triumph over manipulation and lies. One more thing, Callie said as they prepared to leave. Bryson's company is hosting their annual charity gala next month. All the executives will be there, including the board members. A perfect opportunity. Leighton nodded, understanding her intent. Very public, very professional, and very difficult to dismiss or cover up. If we're going to expose them, that's where we do it, Callie finished. We just need to make sure our evidence is ironclad. Then we have 3 weeks, Leighton said, standing and extending his hand. Thank you, Callie, for believing me, for helping. She took his hand, her grip firm and resolute. Thank you for giving me the chance to fight back. They thought they could break us, Leighton. Let's show them how wrong they were. The setting sun cast long shadows through Leighton's temporary apartment as he spread financial documents across his dining room table. 2 weeks had passed since his meeting with Callie, and their investigation had uncovered a web of deception far beyond what either of them had suspected. His phone buzzed with a text from Callie. You need to see this. Coming over now. 20 minutes later, a sharp knock echoed through the apartment. Leighton opened the door to find Callie clutching a leather portfolio. Her face flushed with excitement. I found his backup drive, she announced, striding past him to the table. The idiot kept it in our safe at home, using the same password he's had since college. She pulled out her laptop and a small external drive. You won't believe what's on here. Show me? Leighton pulled up a chair beside her as she connected the drive. Look at these emails. Callie opened a folder filled with correspondence. They've been planning this for months. Bryson didn't just approve Kaya's expenses. He created fake projects to funnel company money into their personal accounts. Leighton leaned closer, scanning the exchanges. They used the charity foundation as a cover? Exactly. Callie's fingers flew across the keyboard. Every donation to these shell companies went straight into offshore accounts they controlled. They were stealing from their own charity. That's why they're so confident. Leighton's voice hardened. They've got a nest egg waiting for when everything falls apart. Had a nest egg? Callie corrected with a grim smile. I've already forwarded everything to my lawyer. He's preparing to freeze the accounts. Their planning was interrupted by Leighton's phone ringing. Kaya's name flashed on the screen. Put it on speaker, Callie whispered. We need to document everything. Leighton answered, his voice carefully neutral. Hello? The kids are asking why you missed Michael's baseball practice again. Kaya's voice dripped with false concern. I had to tell them you were too busy with work. They're starting to think you don't care about them anymore. Don't you dare use our children to manipulate me, Leighton said, his grip tightening on the phone. You're the one who changed the schedule without telling me. Did I? Kaya's laugh was cold. Maybe you should check your emails more carefully. I sent the new schedule last week. It's not my fault if you're too distracted with your investigation to keep up with your parental duties. Leighton's head snapped up, meeting Callie's alarmed gaze. What are you talking about? Please. Kaya's voice hardened. You think I don't know you've been meeting with Callie? That you're not digging through company records? Be careful, Leighton. Your obsession with revenge is only proving my point about your instability. The only thing I'm obsessed with is protecting our children from your lies, Leighton countered. And if you're tracking my movements, that's just more evidence of your manipulation. I'm protecting my interests, Kaya shot back. And right now, you're acting exactly like the unstable, vindictive ex I've been documenting. The judge will be very interested in hearing about your conspiracy theories and harassment. Is that what you call evidence of fraud? Conspiracy theories? A pause. When Kaya spoke again, her voice held a dangerous edge. Be very careful about your next move, Leighton. Remember what you have to lose. No, Kaya. You be careful. Remember what you have to hide. The line went dead. Callie let out a low whistle. She's scared. She should be. Leighton ran a hand through his hair. But this means we need to move faster. She'll try to destroy evidence now that she knows we're onto them. Then let's hit them where it hurts. Callie pulled up another file. The charity gala is in 3 days. I've got the seating chart. Bryson made sure he and Kaya are at the same table, right in front of the stage where the CEO will be giving his speech about corporate integrity. Perfect. Leighton nodded. What about security? Already handled. My friend Marcus works in IT. He's arranged for us to have full access to the presentation system. Callie's smile was sharp. When we're ready, every screen in that ballroom will display our evidence. We'll need backup copies of everything, Leighton said, beginning to gather the documents. They'll try to spin this, claim we doctored the evidence. Already done. Callie patted her laptop. Triple redundancy, secured servers, and copies with 3 different law firms. They can't bury this. Their planning was interrupted by another knock at the door. This one was lighter, familiar. Leighton's heart clenched. He knew that knock. Daddy, Emma's small voice called through the door. Are you home? Leighton shot Callie a panicked look. She quickly began gathering the documents while he moved to the door. Just a minute, sweetheart, he called, giving Callie time to slip into the study with their evidence. Once she was out of sight, he opened the door to find Emma and Michael standing there with Jane, their longtime babysitter. I'm so sorry to drop by unannounced, Jane said, wringing her hands nervously. But Mrs. Adams had an emergency meeting, and she asked me to bring them here since it's your night. My night? Leighton frowned. The schedule she sent said she'd changed it again this morning, Jane explained. Sent an email to everyone on the approved list. She said she told you. Of course she did, Leighton muttered, then forced a smile for his children. Well, this is a wonderful surprise. Who wants pizza? Me. Both kids charged into the apartment, their excitement at seeing him overshadowing any awkwardness about the situation. I'll get going, Jane said, backing toward the elevator. Unless you need me to stay? No, we're good. Thank you, Jane. Leighton waited until she was gone before closing the door and turning to his children. So, who's going to tell me about their day? As the kids chattered about school and friends, Leighton caught movement in his peripheral vision. Callie was slipping quietly toward the door, documents secured in her portfolio. She gave him a subtle nod, mouthing, "I'll call you," before disappearing into the hallway. "Daddy," Emma tugged at his sleeve, her wide eyes curious. "Who was that lady?" "Just a friend from work," Leighton said casually. "Now, what kind of pizza should we order?" Later that night, after the kids were asleep in their designated rooms, he'd insisted on proper beds and spaces for them in the apartment. His phone buzzed with a text from Callie. "Everything's ready for the gala. No turning back now." Leighton looked at his sleeping children, their peaceful faces illuminated by the nightlight. He thought of Kaya's threats, her manipulation, her casual disregard for their well-being in pursuit of her own desires. "Good," he texted back. "It's time they learn they can't threaten our children and get away with it." His phone buzzed again, almost immediately. Kaya just posted on social media about how excited she is for the gala. Called it a celebration of corporate values and integrity. Leighton's laugh was quiet but sharp. Then let's give her something to really celebrate. For the next 2 days, they refined their plan while dealing with Kaya's increasingly obvious attempts to track their movements. She changed the children's schedule daily, tried to schedule last-minute family meetings that conflicted with their preparation time, and even sent mutual friends to question them about their activities. "She's getting desperate," Callie observed during their final planning session. "Bryson's the same way," she added. "He actually tried to convince me to skip the gala. Claimed I was becoming too paranoid about his work relationships." "They know something's coming," Leighton agreed. "But they're too arrogant to guess what. They still think they can manipulate and threaten their way out of anything." "Well," Callie said, closing her laptop with a decisive click. "In exactly 26 hours, they're going to learn just how wrong they are." "No more threats," Leighton nodded. "No more manipulation, just consequences." As he drove home that night, Leighton's phone lit up with one final text from Kaya. "I hope you're prepared for tomorrow night. Remember, anything you do will only prove what I've been saying about you." He didn't bother responding. Tomorrow, actions would speak louder than any words she could twist. Tomorrow, the truth would finally come to light. And Kaya? She would learn that some lines, once crossed, could never be uncrossed. Some betrayals demanded not just exposure, but justice. The grand ballroom of the Riverside Hotel sparkled with crystal chandeliers and corporate sophistication. Men in tuxedos and women in designer gowns mingled around elegant table settings. Champagne flowing freely as Marshall and Burke Financial's annual charity gala hit its stride. Leighton adjusted his bow tie, scanning the room from his position near the audio-visual control booth. Callie's voice came through his earpiece, calm and determined. "Everything's in place. Marcus has the files queued up. Any sign of interference?" Leighton murmured, pretending to check his phone. "None. They're too busy playing the perfect power couple," Callie said, her disgust evident. Third table from the stage. Bryson's got his hand on her back like he's got every right to touch her. Leighton found them in the crowd. Kaya wore a striking red dress that probably cost a month's mortgage payment. She laughed at something Bryson whispered in her ear, her hand resting possessively on his arm. The sight made Leighton's stomach turn. "Mrs. Peterson from the board just arrived," Callie reported. "That's everyone. Time to start the show." Leighton made his way toward the stage, where CEO Richard Maxwell was preparing to give his annual speech about corporate values and charitable giving. The irony wasn't lost on him. "Richard," Leighton caught his boss's attention with a respectful nod. "Do you have a moment?" "Leighton," Richard's face lit up. "Excellent presentation last week. The risk assessment models you developed are revolutionary. We're looking at implementing them company-wide." "That's actually what I needed to discuss," Leighton said, keeping his voice low. "I've uncovered some concerning patterns in the Charity Foundation's finances. Things you need to see immediately." Richard's expression turned serious. "How immediate?" "Right now, before you give your speech." Something in Leighton's tone must have conveyed the urgency. Richard glanced at his watch, then nodded. "My office is just down the hall. 10 minutes. As they walked, Leighton caught Kaya watching them. Her smile faltered slightly as she leaned close to Bryson. whispering something that made him straighten in his chair. Once in Richard's office, Leighton connected his laptop to the large wall monitor. What I'm about to show you will be difficult to process, but every document is verified. Every transaction tracked. Every communication logged. The evidence unfolded across the screen. Fake charitable projects, embezzled funds, manipulated records. Richard's face grew increasingly grave as he absorbed the scope of the fraud. "How long?" he asked finally, his voice tight with controlled anger. "At least 18 months. Leighton brought up the timeline. They used the charity foundation to funnel money into private accounts. Over $2 million, all told. They? Richard's eyes narrowed. Who exactly are we talking about? Bryson Harrison and Kaya Adams, Leighton replied, pulling up their email exchanges. My wife and her boss. They've been working together to defraud the company while carrying on an affair. Richard's sharp intake of breath was the only sign of his shock. These are serious accusations, Leighton, with serious implications. I know. That's why I've spent weeks verifying everything. There's more. Leighton explained the threats, the manipulation, and the attempts to use his children as leverage. They're prepared to destroy lives to protect their scheme. Richard was quiet for a long moment, studying the evidence. Finally, he straightened his jaw set. Come with me. They returned to the ballroom just as the event coordinator was announcing the evening speeches. Richard strode to the stage, his presence commanding immediate attention. Leighton caught Callie's eye across the room and gave her a subtle nod. Ladies and gentlemen, Richard's voice carried clearly through the sound system. Before we begin our planned program, something has come to my attention that requires immediate address. Bryson Harrison and Kaya Adams, please join me on stage. The room went silent. Leighton watched Kaya and Bryson exchange glances, their confident smiles now slightly strained as they made their way forward. Over the past 18 months, Richard continued once they were beside him, Marshall and Burke has prided itself on our charitable contributions. Our foundation has been a beacon of corporate responsibility. Tonight, we're going to examine exactly how those charitable funds have been used. He nodded toward the control booth. Instantly, every screen in the ballroom lit up with transaction records, email exchanges, and bank statements. The evidence Leighton and Callie had gathered played across the displays in damning detail. Mr. Maxwell, Bryson stepped forward, his voice smooth. I can explain. Can you explain this? Callie's voice cut through the murmurs as she strode toward the stage, her own stack of documents in hand. Bank statements showing transfers from the foundation to offshore accounts. Evidence of kickbacks from fake charitable organizations. Or this? Leighton moved to stand beside her, facing his wife. Emails planning how to manipulate and threaten anyone who discovered your scheme. Kaya's face had gone pale, her eyes darting between the displays. This is ridiculous, she said, her voice shaking. A desperate attempt by a jealous husband who happens to be our top risk analyst. Richard cut her off, who documented and verified every transaction, every communication, every cent you stole from children's charities to fund your affair. The ballroom erupted in shocked whispers. Board members leaned forward, examining the evidence with growing outrage. Bryson's confident facade cracked as he recognized his own emails projected larger than life. Security. Richard's voice was steel. Please escort Mr. Harrison and Mrs. Adams to my office. The police are already on their way. You can't do this. Bryson's voice rose with panic. This is a misunderstanding. The only misunderstanding. Callie stepped closer, her voice carrying clearly, was thinking you could threaten and manipulate your way out of consequences. Those days are over. As security moved in, Kaya turned to Leighton, her eyes blazing. You'll regret this. I'll make sure you never see the children again. No, Kaya. Leighton met her gaze steadily. You'll never threaten me with my children again. The judge will be very interested in these emails detailing your plans to use them as weapons. Your manipulation ends tonight. The security team led them away, their protests fading as the ballroom doors closed behind them. In their wake, the room buzzed with shocked conversations and ringing phones as board members began initiating damage control. Richard turned to address the crowd, his voice grave. Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of Marshall and Burke, I apologize for this disruption. Rest assured, we will make this right. Every penny stolen from our charitable foundation will be repaid. Every organization affected will be compensated, and those responsible will face the full consequences of their actions. As the evening dissolved in a chaos around them, Callie touched Layton's arm. You okay? He watched the doors where Kaya had disappeared, feeling not triumph but a deep, cold satisfaction. I'm fine. They thought they could threaten and manipulate their way out of anything. They thought wrong. The police will have questions, Callie said, gesturing to the arriving officers. Are you ready? Layton straightened his shoulders. More than ready. It's time for the whole truth to come out. No more threats. No more manipulation. Just consequences. As they moved to meet the officers, Layton's phone buzzed with a text from his lawyer. Evidence received. Emergency custody hearing scheduled for tomorrow morning. She won't get away with using the children as weapons. Justice, Layton realized, didn't always roar. Sometimes it arrived in the quiet click of handcuffs, in the stern faces of board members reviewing evidence, in the final failure of manipulation and threats. Sometimes it arrived in the simple triumph of truth over lies. Morning sunlight streamed through the courthouse windows as Layton straightened his tie, reviewing his notes one final time. After 3 weeks of preliminary hearings and legal maneuvering, the custody battle had finally reached its decisive moment. James Morton, his attorney, settled into the chair beside him at the plaintiff's table. Are you ready for this? Kaya's lawyer will try to paint you as obsessed and vindictive. They'll use the charity gala incident against you. Let them try. Layton's voice was steady. We have the truth on our side, and the truth includes her threatening to use our children as weapons. The courtroom doors opened, and Kaya entered with her attorney, her designer suit and perfectly styled hair a stark contrast to her pale, drawn face. The criminal charges for fraud had taken their toll, but she still carried herself with defiant pride. All rise, the bailiff called out as Judge Eleanor Martinez entered the courtroom. The Superior Court of the State is now in session. The Honorable Judge Martinez presiding. Be seated, Judge Martinez instructed, settling behind the bench. Her sharp eyes scanned both parties. We're here today for Adams versus Adams, a petition for primary custody. Mr. Morton, you may begin your opening statement. James stood, buttoning his jacket. Your Honor, this case is about more than custody. It's about protecting 2 children from a mother who viewed them not as precious lives to nurture, but as weapons to wield. We will present evidence of Mrs. Adams' deliberate attempts to use these children as leverage to cover up her own misconduct. Evidence that includes recorded threats, manipulated visitation schedules, and a documented pattern of parental alienation. Objection. Kaya's attorney, Patricia Reynolds, interrupted. Counsel is attempting to prejudice the court with unsubstantiated allegations. Those allegations are fully substantiated, James countered, holding up a thick folder. By Mrs. Adams' own words and emails, text messages, and recorded conversations. Messages that explicitly detail her plans to use custody as a weapon against my client. Overruled, Judge Martinez said firmly. Continue, Mr. Morton. For the next hour, James methodically presented their evidence. Text messages threatening to prevent Layton from seeing his children. Emails to Bryson discussing strategies to paint Layton as unstable. Recorded conversations where Kaya admitted to manipulating visitation schedules to interfere with Layton's time with the children. And now, James gestured to his client. I'd like to call Layton Adams to the stand. Layton took the oath and settled into the witness chair, meeting Kaya's cold stare with steady resolve. Mr. Adams, James began, please tell the court about the events leading up to your wife's threats regarding custody. I came home early from work on April 15th to find my wife in bed with her boss, Bryson Harrison, Layton said, his voice calm despite the pain of the memory. When confronted, instead of showing remorse or trying to explain, she immediately threatened to take my children away if I didn't accept her affair and remain quiet. And what exactly did she say? James Morton asked. She told me she'd been building a case against me, claiming I was emotionally abusive and had anger issues. She said, and I quote, "Face it, Layton, if you fight this, you'll lose everything, including the children." How did this threat affect your relationship with your children? She began changing visitation schedules without notice, telling the children I was too busy to see them when, in fact, she never informed me of the changes. She told them I was acting crazy and that they needed to be careful around me. She even recorded our conversations, trying to provoke an angry response she could use against me. Objection. Patricia Reynolds stood. This is hearsay. Your Honor. James held up another document. We have sworn statements from the children's teachers and counselor documenting Mrs. Adams's attempts to alienate the children from their father. Judge Martinez examined the statements. Objection overruled. Continue, Mr. Adams. James turned back to his client. How have your children been affected by their mother's actions? Leighton's hands tightened on the witness stand. They're confused and hurt. Emma's grades have dropped. Michael has started having trouble sleeping. They don't understand why their mother is trying to make them fear me when I've never been anything but loving and supportive. And despite these attempts to alienate them, you've continued fighting for custody? Of course. Leighton's voice strengthened. They're my children. I won't let them be used as pawns in their mother's manipulation. They deserve better than that. No further questions, Your Honor. Patricia Reynolds approached for cross-examination, her heels clicking against the courtroom floor. Mr. Adams, isn't it true that you orchestrated a public humiliation of my client at her company's charity gala? I exposed her illegal activities, Leighton corrected. Activities that included stealing from children's charities to fund her affair. Answer the question, Mr. Adams. Did you deliberately plan to expose your wife at a public event? Yes, I did, because she left me no choice. She was using the threat of taking my children to force me to accept her criminal behavior. Isn't it possible that your wife's concerns about your stability were valid? That your actions at the gala demonstrate exactly the kind of vindictive behavior she feared? Leighton leaned forward. Mrs. Reynolds, let me be very clear. When I discovered my wife's affair, she didn't express remorse. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She immediately threatened to take my children away if I didn't accept her betrayal. When I refused to be blackmailed, she began telling our children I was dangerous. She used their love as a weapon, tried to turn them against me to cover up her own crimes. That's not the action of a concerned mother. That's the action of someone willing to hurt their own children to protect themselves. The courtroom fell silent. Judge Martinez studied him intently. Mr. Adams, what do you hope to achieve with primary custody? I want to give my children stability, Your Honor. I want them to be loved for who they are, not valued for how useful they can be as leverage. I want them to understand that standing up for truth and justice isn't vindictive, it's right. Most of all, I want to protect them from anyone who would use them as weapons, even if that person is their own mother. And if granted custody, would you prevent their mother from seeing them? No, Your Honor. Unlike my wife, I won't use the children to punish someone else. They have a right to know their mother, but they also have a right to be protected from manipulation and emotional abuse. I'm asking for primary custody to ensure that right. Judge Martinez nodded thoughtfully. You may step down, Mr. Adams. Mrs. Adams, please take the stand. Kaya took the witness stand with practiced grace, though her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her silk blouse. The morning light caught the diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist, a gift from Bryson. Leighton realized with disgust. Mrs. Adams, Patricia Reynolds began, please tell the court about your concerns regarding your husband's behavior. It started gradually. Kaya's voice wavered with well-rehearsed emotion. He became increasingly controlling, obsessed with my work schedule, suspicious of my professional relationships. When I tried to establish independence in my career, he grew angry, volatile. Objection. James Morton stood. The witness is making unsubstantiated claims about my client's character. Your Honor, Patricia countered. Mrs. Adams is testifying to her lived experience, which conveniently began only after her affair was discovered. James interrupted. We have years of documentation showing no prior complaints about Mr. Adams's behavior. Judge Martinez raised her hand. I'll allow the testimony, but stick to specific incidents, Mrs. Adams. This court deals in facts, not general character allegations. Kaya's composure slipped slightly before she continued. The night he discovered my relationship with Bryson, he became enraged. He stormed through the house, threatening us. I feared for my safety. Did you document these threats? Patricia prompted. Yes. Kaya reached for a tissue. I began recording our conversations, documenting his outbursts. I was worried about the children's safety. Yet these recordings, James stood again, his voice calm but firm, which the court has reviewed, show no threats or outbursts from my client. They do, however, capture you explicitly threatening to deny him access to his children unless he accepted your affair. Would you like me to play those recordings now? The color drained from Kaya's face. I was trying to protect my children from his increasingly erratic behavior. Like exposing your criminal activities? James approached the witness stand, a document in hand. Your Honor, I'd like to cross-examine the witness now. Judge Martinez nodded. Proceed, Mr. Morton. Mrs. Adams, is it true that you're currently under criminal investigation for embezzling from children's charities? Objection. Patricia jumped up. The criminal charges are not relevant to this custody hearing. They speak directly to the witness's character and her fitness as a parent, James argued. Someone willing to steal from children's charities while using her own children as emotional weapons shows a concerning pattern of behavior. Overruled, Judge Martinez said, her eyes narrowing. Answer the question, Mrs. Adams. Kaya's fingers twisted the tissue. Yes, I am under investigation, but those charges are based on misunderstandings. Misunderstandings? James picked up a document, like this email to Bryson Harrison, dated March 12th, where you write, and I quote, if Leighton causes problems, I'll make sure he never sees the kids again. I've been documenting everything, building a case. No judge will give custody to an emotionally unstable father. That email was taken out of context, or this text message from April 16th. The children are perfect leverage. He'll back down if he thinks he'll lose them. Was that taken out of context too? Tears spilled down Kaya's cheeks. You don't understand. I was desperate. Leighton was trying to destroy everything I'd built with Bryson. Everything you'd built? James's voice rose slightly. You mean the illegal financial scheme that stole money from charitable organizations? Or the elaborate plan to use your children as pawns to cover up your crimes? Objection, Patricia called out, badgering the witness. Sustained, Judge Martinez interceded. Mr. Morton, moderate your tone. James nodded but kept his focus on Kaya. Mrs. Adams, did you or did you not deliberately manipulate visitation schedules to interfere with your husband's time with his children? I had to make adjustments sometimes for work, like on May 3rd, when you told the children their father didn't show up for Michael's baseball game. Even though you had changed the time without informing him, Kaya's facade cracked further. He was investigating me, following me. I had to protect myself. From what, Mrs. Adams? The truth? Is that why you told Emma her father was acting crazy when he was actually gathering evidence of your crimes? You don't understand what it's like. Kaya burst out, her careful composure shattering completely. He wouldn't just accept things and move on. He had to dig and investigate and ruin everything. The children were the only leverage I had left. The courtroom fell silent. Judge Martinez leaned forward, her expression stern. Mrs. Adams, did you just admit to using your children as leverage against their father? Kaya's eyes widened as she realized what she'd said. I didn't mean... I think you meant exactly what you said. Judge Martinez's voice was ice. You may step down. As Kaya returned to her seat, visibly shaken, Judge Martinez reviewed her notes. The only sound in the courtroom was the gentle whir of the air conditioning and the scratch of the judge's pen. Finally, she looked up. I've heard enough. This court's primary concern is the well-being of the children. Based on the evidence presented, including Mrs. Adams' own testimony, I find a clear pattern of parental alienation and emotional manipulation on the mother's part. She turned to Leighton. Mr. Adams has demonstrated a consistent commitment to his children's welfare, even in the face of considerable personal attacks. His actions, while public, were aimed at exposing criminal behavior that directly impacted his children's lives. Your Honor, Patricia began, but Judge Martinez held up her hand. I'm not finished. Mrs. Adams has demonstrated a disturbing willingness to use her children as weapons in her personal battles. Her own words condemn her more thoroughly than any evidence Mr. Adams could present. She straightened in her chair. It is the finding of this court that primary physical custody be awarded to Leighton Adams, with Mrs. Adams granted supervised visitation pending the resolution of her criminal charges. The gavel struck with finality. Court is adjourned. Leighton released a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. James clasped a hand on his shoulder. Congratulations. Justice prevailed. Leighton, Kaya's voice cut through the post-hearing murmurs. She pushed past her attorney, her face contorted with rage. You planned this, she spat. You manipulated the court just like you manipulated everyone else. No, Kaya. Leighton stood his ground as she approached. I simply showed the truth. You did this to yourself. I did this. Her laugh was brittle, hysterical. You've destroyed everything. My reputation, my career, my relationship with my children. You destroyed those things yourself, Leighton said, his voice steady. The moment you decided our children were weapons instead of precious lives to protect. The moment you chose your affair over their well-being. The moment you thought you could threaten and manipulate your way out of consequences. You'll regret this, she hissed, tears streaming down her face. You have no idea what you've done. I know exactly what I've done. Leighton met her gaze firmly. I protected our children from someone willing to hurt them to save herself. That's what a parent does, Kaya. Not that you'd understand that anymore. As security officers approached to escort her away, Kaya's mask crumbled completely. Please, she sobbed, reaching for him. Please don't take my children. I'll do anything. You already did everything. Leighton stepped back. Everything to hurt them. Everything to hurt me. Everything to protect yourself. Now you can live with those choices. He watched as she was led away, her sobs echoing through the courthouse corridor. James gathered their documents, his expression grave. Ready to go get your children? Leighton nodded, straightening his tie. More than ready. It's time they came home to someone who puts them first. 1 week after the custody hearing, Leighton stood on his mother's front porch, watching early summer roses sway in the evening breeze. He'd received dozens of messages from Marlene since the gala exposure. Calls, texts, emails, all begging him to talk. Now, with the custody battle won and his children safely settled in their new home, he was finally ready for this last confrontation. The door opened before he could knock. Marlene looked smaller somehow, more fragile than he remembered. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her usually perfectly styled hair showing signs of neglect. Leighton, she breathed his name like a prayer. You came. I wasn't sure. We need to talk? He kept his voice neutral. May I come in? She stepped back, gesturing toward the familiar kitchen. The cookie jar sat empty on the counter for the first time in his memory. There was no smell of baking in the air. Marlene's hands fluttered nervously as she pulled out a chair. Can I get you anything? Coffee? I could make. Just talk, Mom. Leighton remained standing, studying the woman who had chosen to support his wife's betrayal over her own son. You wanted to see me. Here I am. Marlene sank into a kitchen chair, her shoulders slumping. I saw the news about Kaya's arrest, the fraud charges, the custody hearing. I had no idea things had gone so far. Really? Leighton's voice hardened. You had no idea when you told me to accept her affair? When you threatened to disown me if I didn't let her destroy our families? I was trying to protect you. Marlene's voice cracked. After what happened with your father, I couldn't bear to see another divorce tear this family apart. I thought if you could just work through it. Leighton's laugh was sharp. She was stealing from children's charities to fund her affair. She threatened to take my children away. She tried to paint me as abusive to cover her crimes. And you supported her. I was wrong, Marlene whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. I was so wrong, Leighton. I let my own past cloud my judgment. I was so afraid of history repeating itself that I couldn't see what was really happening. What was happening, Leighton said, his voice like steel, was that my wife betrayed everything we built together. She threatened to destroy me if I didn't accept her betrayal. And when I came to you for support, you chose her side. You threatened to cut me off from my own mother. I know. Marlene reached for his hand, but he stepped back. Please, sweetheart, I've been sick with guilt. I've barely slept since I learned what Kaya did, how she used the children as weapons. I should have supported you. I should have been there for you. But you weren't. Leighton moved to the window, looking out at the garden where he'd played as a child. You weren't there when I needed my mother most. You weren't there when I had to fight alone to protect my children. You chose the path of least resistance, just like you did with Dad. That's not fair, is it? Marlene's voice was a whisper as she wiped her tears. Leighton turned back to face her. Dad cheated, and you accepted it to keep the peace. He left, and you taught me it was somehow my fault for not being understanding enough. Kaya cheated, and you told me to swallow my pride and accept it. When does it end, Mom? When do we stop letting people destroy us just to avoid conflict? Marlene's hands trembled as she clasped them together. I was wrong about your father. I was wrong about everything. Seeing you stand up to Kaya, fight for what's right despite the cost. You're stronger than I ever was. Braver than I ever could be. This isn't about bravery, Leighton said, his voice softening slightly. This is about doing what's right. About teaching my children that truth matters. That we don't accept betrayal just to keep the peace. Please. Marlene stood, her voice breaking. Please don't cut me out of your life. Don't take my grandchildren away. I'll do anything to make this right. Anything. Leighton studied her face. Will you admit that you were wrong to support Kaya? That you let your own fears and weakness guide you instead of standing up for what's right? Yes, she whispered. Yes to all of it. I was weak. I was afraid. I chose the easy path instead of the right one. I failed you as a mother, and I will regret that for the rest of my life. Leighton was quiet for a long moment, letting her words hang in the air. Finally, he spoke. Trust has to be earned back, Mom. Just like respect. Just like relationships. I won't cut you out of our lives completely. The children love their grandmother. But things will never be the same between us. That trust is broken. I understand, Marlene said, her voice small. Can you ever forgive me? Forgiveness isn't the same as forgetting. Leighton moved toward the door. I'll allow supervised visits with the children. You can start rebuilding relationships with them. But our relationship? That will take more time, and it will never be what it was. At least you're giving me a chance, Marlene said as she followed him to the door. That's more than I deserve. Maybe. Leighton paused in the doorway. But I'm not doing it for you. I'm doing it because my children deserve to learn that people can change, can admit their mistakes. But they also need to learn that actions have consequences. And trust, once broken, is never quite the same. He left her standing in the doorway, her tears falling silently as he walked away. The drive home felt lighter somehow, as if the last weight had been lifted from his shoulders. The sun was setting as he pulled into his driveway. Through the front window, he could see Emma and Michael doing homework at the kitchen table, their faces illuminated by the warm glow of the lamp he'd bought to make their new house feel more like home. Inside, the smell of baking cookies, his own attempt at chocolate chip, filled the air. Michael looked up from his math homework with a grin. Dad, did you remember to set the timers? 10 minutes left, Leighton replied, ruffling his son's hair as he passed. How's the algebra coming along? Better. Michael held up his worksheet proudly. I figured out where I was going wrong with the equations. Emma closed her history book. Dad, is everything okay? You seemed worried when you left earlier. Leighton sat down between his children, looking at their concerned faces. So perceptive, so resilient despite everything they'd been through. Everything's fine, sweetheart. I just had to have an important conversation with someone about trust and consequences. Like with Mom? Emma's voice was quiet. Similar, Leighton said, choosing his words carefully. Sometimes people make choices that hurt us. And while we can forgive them, we also have to protect ourselves from being hurt again. That's not being mean or vindictive. It's being wise. The timer beeped, and Michael jumped up. Cookies are done. As Leighton helped his son carefully remove the cookies from the oven, he caught sight of their reflection in the kitchen window. Father and children, working together, learning together, healing together. Outside, the last rays of sunlight painted the sky in shades of promise. This wasn't the life he'd planned. The betrayals of Kaya and his mother had left scars that would never fully fade. But as he watched his children laugh and joke over warm cookies, he knew this life was one worth fighting for. But standing here, watching his children laugh over slightly burned cookies, Leighton knew he'd made the right choice. He had drawn his line in the sand, stood firm for truth and justice. and built something stronger from the ashes of betrayal. For Michael, the path forward wouldn't always be easy. There would be more challenges, more difficult conversations, more moments of doubt. But he would face them with the same determination that had carried him through the darkness. Because some things were worth fighting for. Some principles couldn't be compromised. Some lines, once drawn, had to be defended. And in that defense, in that unwavering stand for truth and justice, Leighton had found not just victory, but redemption. Not just custody, but clarity. Not just an ending, but a new beginning. Sometimes life tests us in ways we never imagined. But in standing up for truth, for justice, and for those we love, we find not only strength but clarity. Leighton's journey shows us that even in the face of betrayal and hardship, it's possible to rebuild something stronger. Some battles are worth fighting, and some lines, once drawn, must be defended. In choosing to protect his children and stand for what's right, Leighton didn't just find victory. He found redemption, clarity, and the beginning of a new chapter filled with hope.